The first light of day seeped gently over the horizon, its pale gold touching the rippled surface of the harbor. The air still carried the cool hush of night, laced with the faint scent of salt and damp wood. Fishing boats rested at their moorings, their hulls rocking in an almost imperceptible rhythm, ropes creaking softly like the sigh of a sleeping child. Nets hung from their wooden frames, dark and heavy from the night's work, while gulls, still half asleep, perched along the pier's edge, their silhouettes softened against the rising glow. The town beyond stirred only faintly, shutters still drawn against the early chill. A single lamp flickered in the small bakery by the quay, its warm light spilling across cobblestones slick from the morning tide. Somewhere, a kettle sang quietly on a stovetop, the promise of tea mingling with the scent of rising bread. Fishermen in thick woolen sweaters moved without urgency, their steps deliberate, the quiet language of routine guiding them as they tended to lines and checked their gear. As the sun climbed a fraction higher, the water caught fire in ripples of copper and rose, each swell carrying the reflection of a day yet to be lived. The world here did not rush to meet it. Instead, the harbor breathed slowly, cradled in its own shelter, content to let the morning unfurl in its own time. A soft wind passed through the masts, humming a tune that had echoed in this place for generations, carrying with it the sense that life here was measured not by the clock, but by the tide.
A silver mist lingered over the water, softening the edges of the moored vessels until they seemed like painted shapes from a half-remembered dream. The air was still, except for the faint lap of waves against the barnacled posts of the pier. On the far side of the harbor, the stone breakwater stretched into the distance, its wet surface gleaming faintly where the tide had kissed it. A fisherman's dog, drowsy and content, lay curled in a coil of rope, its ears twitching to the distant sound of a bell from the chapel above the town. Windows began to open one by one along the row of whitewashed cottages. From within, the smell of wood smoke and boiling oats drifted out into the cool air. A young boy, barefoot and still wrapped in the haze of sleep, stepped outside to watch his father mend a net. The twine was damp and cool to the touch, and the father's fingers worked methodically, the pattern known so well that his eyes often wandered toward the shifting colors of the sky. The dawnlight had grown into a tender blush, laying itself across the harbor like a warm shawl. The sails of docked boats stirred gently in a wind that barely lifted the sea's skin. From the hillside above, the narrow streets wound down toward the quay, cobblestones gleaming from the damp of the night. The faint sound of a cartwheel turning could be heard, a fishmonger's barrow making its way toward the market square. Along the shore, a woman in a faded linen apron washed vegetables in the tide's retreat, her hands moving steadily in the cool water. Small fish darted in the shallows near her feet, their quick silvery flashes catching the low sun. The cats gathered nearby, their tails curling patiently as they waited for any small offering. The woman's face bore the calm of someone long accustomed to mornings like these, where the pace of life was dictated by the sun and sea, and where each movement held a quiet dignity. The boats swayed as though in conversation with one another, masts leaning slightly with the tide's pull. A cluster of fishermen spoke in low voices, their words carried away in the breeze before they could settle on the ear. Somewhere high in the steeple, a single chime marked the passing of another hour, though the harbor paid it no mind. The scent of baking bread reached the water's edge, mingling with the salt air in a way that felt like an embrace. In the soft, golden hush, the day was beginning not with haste, but with the deep exhale of a place at peace with its own rhythm.
Mist clung to the harbor walls as if reluctant to leave, curling in thin veils around the masts and rigging. The water's surface was smooth enough to mirror the faint colors of the waking sky, interrupted only by the lazy circle of a seabird drifting overhead. From the quay, the sound of slow footsteps approached, an elderly man with a weathered cap and a wicker basket balanced on his hip. He paused at the edge of the pier to watch the tide move, his eyes narrowing not from strain, but from the pleasure of small details. Near the boat sheds, the door to a cooper's workshop stood ajar, letting out the scent of shaved cedar and linseed oil. Inside, wooden barrels waited in neat rows, each bound with iron hoops that glinted faintly in the growing light. Across the way, a boy balanced along the breakwater, his arms stretched for balance as he traced its slick, seaweed-covered stones toward the point. The harbor's dogs stretched themselves awake, tails thudding gently against crates and benches. A heron landed on a post, its long legs folding in stillness, its gaze fixed on the glimmer of fish beneath the shallows. Farther out, the first sail caught the day's wind, drifting past the headland at a pace that seemed untouched by urgency. The town itself breathed quietly, its chimneys sighing pale smoke into the brightening air. The old man lingered a moment longer before turning back, his basket still empty, yet somehow heavier with the quiet company of the morning. The first glints of sunlight brushed the water, catching on the ropes that looped from mast to mast, like drawn lines in a sketchbook. A gull's cry rose once, sharp against the otherwise softened silence, and then the harbor returned to its gentle murmur. The tide was at its lowest, revealing the broad wooden ribs of a half-beached boat, their grain darkened by years of salt and weather. A man crouched beside it, tapping carefully at a seam with a small mallet, the sound carrying like a heartbeat across the quay. In the upper windows of the nearest cottages, embroidered curtains shifted as their owners leaned out to greet the air. The smell of steeping tea joined that of tar and rope, blending into a scent that belonged only to this hour. Two children, wrapped in woolen shawls, sat side by side on a crate, swinging their legs and sharing a warm heel of bread between them. Along the edge of the pier, green moss glistened underfoot, and the occasional drop of seawater fell from a rope or beam, each one marking time more slowly than any clock could. From the front of the harbor, a single vessel approached, its small white sail shaped like a cupped hand cradling the wind. Its arrival stirred nothing hurried, only the slow gathering of eyes and quiet waves from those who knew it well. In this softened light, even movement seemed like an extension of rest. The harbor wore the colors of porcelain, pale blue fading to pearl, the faintest wash of gold along the horizon. The smell of salt hung in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of wet nets spread to dry along the quay. A pair of women worked side by side, folding those nets with practiced ease, their hands moving without the need for words. Every so often they paused, not to rest, but to watch the distant shimmer of the open sea. Nearby, a man sat cross-legged on the deck of his small boat, oiling the worn wood of an oar. His motions were slow, as though he understood that speed would only cheat the moment of its worth. Behind him, the water lapped in a rhythm that matched his own breath. Overhead, swallows darted and dipped, their wings catching the new light in fleeting sparks. From the far end of the harbor wall, the first merchant's cart arrived, its wheels whispering over the stone path. A single bell chimed from the tower on the hill, the sound rolling down toward the water like a low tide. Across the harbor, reflections of the masts trembled in the water, each movement like a line drawn by an invisible hand. The morning here did not begin with announcement, but with a slow gathering of sounds, scents, and stillness that seemed to hold the world in balance. The morning unfolded in layers, first the hush, then the pale light, and finally the slow chorus of the harbor coming alive. From the shadow of the cliffs, a small skiff emerged, its hull painted in colors dulled by years of salt spray. The rowers' strokes were deliberate, each dip of the oar scattering rings across the mirrored surface. The sound was joined by the soft thud of boots on the pier as a baker delivered warm loaves to the sailors' benches. The quay was strewn with the tools of the trade, coiled ropes, empty baskets, a net mender's stool. The smell of yeast and wood smoke drifted in from the town above, wrapping itself around the sharper scent of seaweed. Near the water's edge, an old woman sat with her knitting, her needles clicking softly in time with the waves. She did not look up often, but when she did, it was to watch the gulls ride the invisible currents of the warming air. A lantern still burned in the window of the harbor-master's hut, its glow paling against the rising sun. The boats shifted gently against their moorings, creaking as though exchanging quiet greetings. Beyond the breakwater, the horizon blurred into the sky, the two sharing a palette of gentle grays and washed gold. The day would grow brighter, busier, perhaps even loud, but in these moments the harbor belonged entirely to stillness.